The order came on a Tuesday morning, read aloud in the processing yard while the Tennessee heat was already building into something with weight and intention. Corporal James Whitfield stood at the front of the yard with a clipboard and read it the way he read everything, flatly, without editorial, each word placed with the economy of a man who understood that the information itself was sufficient and required no assistance from his tone. The German-speaking clerk beside him translated as he went. All prisoners will surrender their uniforms for delousing and processing. Civilian clothing will be issued in exchange. The procedure is required by Army regulation and is consistent with Geneva Convention standards for prisoner processing. You will be called by number. When your number is called, you will proceed to the processing building. He lowered the clipboard. He looked at the group of 31 women standing in the yard with the expression of a man who had delivered this information and considered his obligation complete. Nobody moved. Not immediately. The words had landed in the specific way that certain words land, not as sound but as physical fact, rearranging the air around the people who received them. A woman to Greta's left made a sound that was not quite a word. Another, further back, touched the collar of her uniform with 2 fingers. Greta Schreiber stood very still. She was 30 years old, from Munich, and she had worn a Wehrmacht uniform for 3 years. She had worn it through the last winter in a signals office outside Stuttgart where the windows had no glass, and the cold came through the walls, as if the walls were not there. She had worn it through the surrender, through the transit camps in France, through the crossing, through the truck ride from the port that had taken them through a Tennessee she had no framework for, green, enormous, indifferent, its summer heat pressing against the canvas like something alive. She had worn it this morning when she woke and dressed in the barracks and walked to the processing yard in the early light. She was still wearing it now, standing in the yard with Whitfield's words somewhere in the air above her, and she understood with complete clarity that she was about to stop. The propaganda had been specific about this moment. Not vague, specific. She had been briefed in the final weeks before capture, when the shape of what was coming had become impossible to ignore, by a female officer who spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering information she believed absolutely. They will take the uniforms, the officer had said. They will tell you it is procedure, that it is required. They will use the language of rules and regulations to make it seem administrative. It is not administrative. It is deliberate. They want you without rank, without structure, without anything that tells you and them what you are. A woman without a uniform in an enemy camp is not a prisoner of war. She is simply a woman. And a woman without protection in an enemy camp. She had not finished the sentence. She had not needed to. Greta had carried that unfinished sentence through France and across the Atlantic and through 3 weeks of Tennessee summer, and it was present now, in the yard, as Whitfield lowered his clipboard. Lena appeared at her shoulder. Lena Brandt was 24, from Cologne, and had the quality of someone who processed the world through observation rather than analysis. She noticed things before she understood them, felt the temperature of a room before she could name what had changed it. She said quietly, "Greta." "I heard," Greta said. "What do you think?" "I don't know yet." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, he didn't say it like it was a punishment. Greta looked at Whitfield, who was now speaking quietly to the clerk about the processing order, his attention already on the next procedural step, the yard and the women in it simply the current item on a list that had other items after it. "No," she said. He didn't. This did not comfort her. She had been briefed on this too, the performance of administrative neutrality designed to lower resistance. The use of procedural language to make violations seem routine. She knew what it looked like. She was looking at it. She told herself she was looking at it. Her name, her number, would be called. She would walk into the processing building. She would hand over the uniform that had been, for 3 years, the external structure of everything she understood herself to be. She would receive in exchange a piece of American-made civilian clothing, something without rank or insignia, or the specific grammar of a system that had told her daily, through the language of fabric and cut, that she was something defined and placed and purposeful. And then she would be. She reached for the word and found it insufficient before she arrived at it. Simply a woman. In a camp. In Tennessee. In a dress. The cicadas in the oak trees beyond the yard were producing their enormous continuous sound, the kind of sound that stops registering as sound after a while and becomes simply the texture of the air. The heat pressed. The sky above the processing building was the flat white blue of a southern summer morning with no intention of changing. Whitfield called the first number. A woman near the front of the group moved forward. Greta watched her walk toward the processing building and held herself very straight in the Tennessee heat and waited for her own number and said nothing, to Lena or to anyone, about the unfinished sentence she had been carrying since Stuttgart. It was still there. It had not resolved. She was not certain, standing in the yard, whether that made it more likely to be true or less. She did not yet have enough information to decide. Hey, if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for your support. Also, I'd love to know which part of the US you're watching from. Let me know in the comments below. The building was plain wood and ceiling fans and the smell of laundry soap and pine resin, and it was cooler inside than the yard, which was the first thing Greta noticed and immediately distrusted. Comfort as technique. She filed it and kept walking. The interior had been arranged with the same flat efficiency that characterized everything the Americans did. A long counter running the width of the room, 2 clerks seated behind it with ledgers open, a row of wooden chairs along the left wall, a door at the back marked with a hand-lettered sign she couldn't read. Whitfield stood near the counter. The German-speaking clerk stood beside him. 2 other soldiers moved through the room with the purposeful unhurry of men performing a task they had performed before. The women were called forward one at a time. Greta sat in one of the wooden chairs and watched the procedure with the focused attention she had applied to everything for 3 years. She watched a woman from her unit, Hannelore, 40, former clerk from Hamburg, approach the counter and surrender her uniform jacket to the first clerk, who checked a tag against a ledger entry, wrote something, and handed her a folded piece of clothing in return. Hannelore took it and looked at it and said nothing. She was directed to a curtained area near the back wall. She emerged 2 minutes later in a cotton dress. It was plain, light blue, short sleeves, a simple collar. The kind of dress worn by the kind of woman who did not need clothing to announce anything about her. Hannelore stood at the edge of the curtained area with her uniform folded over her arm and the dress on her body, and her face carried an expression Greta recognized, because she had been managing the same expression all morning. The expression of someone who has lost something they cannot yet account for. Lena leaned close and said, "It isn't ugly." "That's not the point," Greta said. "I know," Lena said. "I'm trying to find something to say." "Then don't." Lena sat back. Greta watched Hannelore carry her folded uniform to the counter where the clerk tagged it, wrapped it, and placed it on a shelf behind him with the systematic indifference of someone filing a document. She watched the tag written. She watched the number recorded. She watched Hannelore receive a slip of paper, a receipt, presumably the same system they had used for the jewelry in France, and fold it carefully and place it inside the dress pocket. The receipt existed. The procedure existed. The ledger existed. This was the part that troubled her most, and she had not said this to Lena because saying it would require admitting that the trouble was not what she had expected. She had expected chaos, anticipated the violation that arrived without paperwork, without procedure, without the pretense of rule. That was what the briefings had described. That was what the unfinished sentence had pointed toward. Instead, there was a ledger, a tag, a receipt. The Americans had won the war and could do as they pleased with the women they held, and what pleased them, apparently, was documentation. She turned this over and could not find the cruelty inside it. Her number was called. She stood. She walked to the counter and looked at the clerk, young, perhaps 22, with the unremarkable face of someone performing the 14th iteration of the same task, and she placed her hands flat on the counter and waited. The clerk checked his ledger. He wrote her number. He looked up and said something in English. The translator said, "Jacket and trousers, please. Please." The word arrived with a small, specific impact she had not prepared for. Not a command dressed as courtesy. She knew what that sounded like. Simply the word a person used when asking another person for something. She had heard it used the same way at the jewelry table in France, and it had troubled her then too, and she had filed it as technique and moved on. She removed her jacket. She placed it on the counter. She held the posture of someone who was doing this because the procedure required it and not because she had been reduced to it. Shoulders level, chin level, the precise physical grammar of a woman who understood the difference between surrender and compliance and intended the clerk to understand it too. The clerk took the jacket without looking at her face, tagged it, wrote in the ledger. He reached under the counter and placed a folded dress in front of her. Greta looked at it. Cotton. Yellow, this one. Small white buttons at the collar. A dress that belonged to no category she had ever inhabited. Not civilian in the way of her life before the uniform. Not military. Not the hybrid of the auxiliary service. A dress that was simply a dress, carrying no information about its wearer beyond approximate size. She picked it up. The fabric was soft in a way she had not expected. Not new. Washed many times, broken in. The kind of softness that required use rather than manufacture. Someone had worn this before her. Many someones, perhaps. The dress had a history she had no access to, and she was about to step into it. She turned toward the curtained area. The door at the back of the room opened. Not the curtained area, the actual door, the one with the hand-lettered sign, the one that had been closed since they entered. It opened with the specific sound of a door that opened frequently and without ceremony, and a woman came through it carrying a stack of folded dresses against her chest, her chin resting on the top of the pile to keep it balanced. She was perhaps 45. American civilian clothing, a practical blouse, a skirt, flat shoes. Brown hair pinned up without particular attention to the result. She walked to the counter with the directness of someone who knew exactly where she was going, and placed the stack down, and said something to Whitfield in English that made him nod and point toward the curtained area. She turned. She looked at the room with the quick, comprehensive look of someone assessing a practical situation. How many women? What sizes? What was needed? And her gaze moved across the group without the weight of judgment or the performance of compassion. She was simply looking. Her eyes stopped on Greta. She crossed the room in 8 steps and stood in front of her and looked at the yellow dress in Greta's hands, and then at Greta's shoulders, and then back at the dress. She held up one finger, wait, and went back to the stack she had brought in. She sorted through it quickly, found what she wanted, and came back. She held up a different dress. Green, slightly larger through the shoulders. She looked at Greta with a question in her expression that required no translation. This one. Greta looked at the green dress. She looked at this woman, Dorothy Marsh, though Greta did not yet know her name, standing in front of her in a room full of German prisoners with a dress held out, and an entirely matter-of-fact expression, the expression of a woman who had looked at another woman and made a practical assessment and acted on it without ceremony or significance. No performance. No lesson. No strategy visible beneath the surface. Just a woman who had looked at another woman and thought, that one fits better. Greta took the green dress. Dorothy nodded once, picked up the yellow one, returned it to the stack, and moved on to the next woman. The entire exchange had taken perhaps 30 seconds. Greta stood in the middle of the processing room holding a green cotton dress, and felt something shift, small, structural, the specific movement of something load-bearing that has been asked to carry more than it was built for. She did not name it. She turned and walked to the curtained area and changed her clothes. When she came out, the uniform was on the counter, and the dress was on her body, and the room was the same room it had been before. The fans turning, the ledger open, Whitfield at the counter, the Tennessee cicadas audible even through the walls. Everything was the same. She was not. She stood at the edge of the curtain and looked for the language to describe what had changed and found that it was not available yet, that it existed somewhere ahead of her, waiting to be arrived at, in the days and weeks of this camp that stretched forward into a summer she had not planned for. Lena appeared beside her. She looked at the green dress and then at Greta's face. She said nothing. For once, Greta was grateful for it. The dress was wrong in ways Greta could not have anticipated. Not the fit. Dorothy had been right about the shoulders, and the green cotton sat correctly on her body in the functional sense. Wrong in the way of a language you do not speak being spoken at you. She moved through the camp's first days and felt the absence of the uniform as a continuous low-grade static, a frequency just below hearing that was always present. Without rank there was no grammar. No system of recognition that told the room who you were before you opened your mouth. In the Wehrmacht the uniform had done that work automatically. A glance was sufficient to establish position, function, history. Here, in cotton, she was simply a woman among women, and the Americans who moved through the camp looked at her the way they looked at everyone else, which was to say with the professional neutrality of people managing a population rather than engaging with individuals. She told herself this was fine. It was correct, even. She was a prisoner. Neutrality was what the Geneva Convention required. She told herself this several times. On the third day Dorothy Marsh appeared in the barracks with a sewing kit. She came in the late afternoon when the heat had peaked and was beginning, reluctantly, to ease. She carried a small wooden box and a canvas bag, and she looked around the room at the women sitting on bunks, and said something brief, and held up the sewing kit by way of explanation. The dresses needed taking in. Several of them hung wrong. Too wide through the waist, too long at the hem. Dorothy had apparently noticed this, and found it a problem worth correcting. She sat up at the table near the window, and called the first woman over with a gesture. She worked quickly and without conversation, pinning, measuring with her eye rather than a tape, her hands moving through the fabric with the efficiency of someone who had been sewing since childhood and did not need to think about it anymore. She asked questions through gesture. Is this comfortable? Is this too tight? Does this feel right? The women answered through gesture in return. The exchange had no language and required none. Greta sat on her bunk and watched. She was watching for the performance, the deliberate theater of kindness staged for a specific effect. She had been watching for it since the processing building, since the green dress, since Dorothy's 30-second assessment, and the complete absence of ceremony in it. She kept watching and kept failing to find it. What she found instead was a woman who was bothered by dresses that fit badly, and was fixing them. That was the entire visible content of the situation. Lena came and sat beside her. She came back, Lena said quietly. Yes. She didn't have to. No. Lena watched Dorothy pin the hem on Hannelor's dress and said, "What do you think she gets from it?" It was the same question Greta had been asking. She had been applying it to every interaction since arrival. What does this person get from this gesture? Where is the return? What is the investment designed to produce? It was a sound analytical approach. It had served her for 3 years. The problem was that it kept producing no answer. "I don't know," Greta said. Lena looked at her sideways. She had never heard Greta say those words before. Dorothy called Greta over with a look. Greta stood and crossed the room and stood in front of her. Dorothy looked at the green dress, at the waist, at the hem, at the way the fabric fell, and made a small sound of assessment and reached for her pins. She worked in silence. Her hands moved around Greta's waist with the impersonal efficiency of someone measuring, not touching. The specific professional neutrality of a person whose attention was on the fabric rather than the person wearing it. Greta stood still. She had stood still through 3 years of difficult things. She was good at it. But there was something about standing in a Tennessee barracks in a cotton dress, while an American woman pinned her hem in the late afternoon light, that required a different quality of stillness. Not the controlled stillness of discipline, but the fragile stillness of someone who does not yet trust what their body might do if they moved. Dorothy sat back on her heels and looked at the result. She nodded once. She stood and made a small adjustment at the shoulder seam with 2 fingers and looked again. She said something in English. One of the other women who had been learning phrases translated without being asked. "She says it suits you." Dorothy was already moving to the next woman. Dorothy was already moving to the next woman. She said it the way you say something when it is simply true and the person it is true about should know it. Not a compliment administered for effect. A fact delivered because it was accurate. Greta stood at the center of the room in the pinned dress and looked at Dorothy's back. The framework was not gone. She was precise about this. Every explanation was still available. She could still construct the argument that this was performance, that the sewing kit and the returned visits and the matter-of-fact assessments were elements of a calculated approach to prisoner management. She could construct it. She simply could not make it feel true anymore. That gap, between the argument she could build and the truth she could feel, was new. She had not lived in that gap before. She had always been on one side of it or the other, either knowing or not knowing. This was different. This was knowing the argument and feeling its emptiness simultaneously, and having no third option available. She went back to her bunk. Outside, the Tennessee evening was beginning its slow, heavy descent. The cicadas continued. The oak trees were dark against the last light. The camp settled into its evening routines with the consistency of a place that had absorbed many groups of women before this one, and would absorb many after. Greta sat on her bunk and said nothing. Lena, beside her, said nothing either. The green dress hung correctly now, or would when the pins were sewn. It was the right size. It fit. It was, as Dorothy had said, simply and without agenda, a dress that suited her. She did not know what to do with that. Lena's fever came on a Thursday night. It arrived the way fevers arrive, gradually, then all at once. By morning she was hot to the touch and moving through the barracks with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body has become unreliable. Greta put her hand on Lena's forehead and felt the heat and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to the infirmary." "It's nothing," Lena said. "It's a fever." "Greta, I'll take you." She said it the way she said most things, as a fact that had already been decided, not a proposal under discussion. Lena recognized the tone and stopped arguing. The infirmary was a long, low building at the eastern edge of the camp, its white paint bright in the morning sun. A medic met them at the door, young, efficient, with the quick assessment of someone trained to triage, and took Lena's temperature and looked at her eyes and tongue and said something to a colleague, and then said to Greta, through gesture, that Lena would need to wait inside. He said something else. The gesture was clear. "You wait here." He pointed to a row of wooden chairs in the entrance room. Lena was taken through an interior door. It closed. Greta sat down. The entrance room was plain. The chairs, a small table with a water pitcher, a window overlooking the yard. A ceiling fan turned slowly. From somewhere inside the building came the quiet sounds of a medical facility operating, soft footsteps, the occasional voice, the specific institutional quiet of a place organized around the management of physical suffering. She sat with her hands in her lap and waited. She was familiar with waiting. She had waited through bombardments, through retreats, through the long administrative silences of a collapsing army. She had developed a quality of waiting that was almost mechanical, the body stilled, the mind set to its lowest useful frequency, the passage of time accepted as a condition rather than experienced as duration. This was different. This was the waiting of someone whose body refused to still, because the thing being waited on was not abstract. Lena was 24 and from Cologne and had sat beside Greta in the processing building and said it isn't ugly about the dress, trying to find something useful to offer. And she was now on the other side of a door in an American military infirmary, and Greta did not know what was happening to her. She sat with her hands in her lap and felt the specific weight of that not knowing. Dorothy Marsh came through the front door 20 minutes later. She was carrying a folder and appeared to be doing something administrative, checking supplies, delivering paperwork, some task that had brought her to the infirmary on an ordinary Thursday morning as part of an ordinary Thursday routine. She spoke briefly to the medic at the desk. He pointed at something in her folder. She nodded and made a note. Then she turned toward the chairs and saw Greta. She stopped. She looked at Greta's face with the same quick, comprehensive assessment she applied to everything. The same look she had used in the processing building to determine dress sizes. The same look she had used in the barracks to evaluate hems. Practical, direct, taking in what was actually there rather than what was expected. What was actually there, on Greta's face, was something she had been managing unsuccessfully for 20 minutes. The controlled expression had developed a fault line, not visible as emotion exactly, more as the particular tightness of someone holding something together that wants to come apart. Dorothy closed her folder. She crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside Greta. She did not speak. She did not reach for the German phrases she did not have. She did not produce an expression of performed sympathy or the professional warmth of someone managing a distressed prisoner. She simply sat down in the chair the way you sit down beside someone who is waiting alone and should not be waiting alone. She looked at the door Lena had gone through. Then she looked forward at the opposite wall. And she waited too. Greta sat beside her and felt something she could not immediately locate in any of her existing categories. She looked at this woman, American, civilian, a stranger in every meaningful sense, sitting beside her in a camp infirmary on a Thursday morning with no reason to be there except that she had looked at a face and sat down. No procedure requiring it. No rule producing it. No strategic purpose served by it. Just a woman who had seen another woman frightened and had sat down. The argument was still available. She reached for it automatically. The calculated performance, the managed humanity, the investment in prisoner compliance. She had built it carefully over weeks, and it was still structurally sound. She reached for it, and found that it no longer had any weight. Not broken, not disproven, simply weightless. The kind of argument that is technically intact and practically finished, like a map of a city that no longer exists, accurate to its original subject, useless for navigation. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried, and the Tennessee infirmary was not the place, and Dorothy sitting beside her was not the occasion. But something released. Quietly, without drama, the way things release when you have been holding them past the point of necessity and your hands simply open. She sat in the wooden chair with her hands in her lap and the ceiling fan turning above her and Dorothy Marsh beside her looking at the opposite wall, and she let the argument go. The medic came out 40 minutes later. He spoke to Greta directly, which she noted, not to the room, not to the chair in general, but to her, with the eye contact of someone addressing the person who needed the information. A mild infection. Rest, water, 2 days of light duty. Nothing serious. Greta translated the gestures correctly before he had finished speaking. She looked at the door and then back at the medic and said, in the careful English she had been using for weeks without advertising it, "Can I see her?" The medic looked at her, mildly surprised, not at the English but at the question, the specific quality of the question, and nodded and held the door open. Greta stood. She turned, as simply the fact of time having passed, and changed the ground she was standing on. That evening she folded the green dress carefully and placed it in her bag. Lena watched from her bunk. "You're keeping it?" "Yes." "Why?" Greta smoothed the fabric with her palm. The cotton was soft from weeks of washing. It held no rank, no insignia, no information about its wearer except that someone had looked at her and thought, "That one fits better." She didn't answer Lena's question immediately. Then she said, "Because I was wrong about something. And I want to remember what being wrong felt like." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Wrong about what specifically?" Greta placed the dress in the bag. "I thought the worst thing they could do was take the uniform," she said. "I thought without it I would be nothing. Just a woman in a camp with no protection." She closed the bag. "But a woman came in with a stack of dresses and looked at my shoulders and handed me the right size. And then she sat beside me in a waiting room because I looked frightened." A pause. "That's not what nothing looks like." Lena said nothing. Outside, the Tennessee summer was doing what Tennessee summers do at the end of August, pressing its full weight against everything. The cicadas at their loudest, the oaks dark and full, the sky holding its heat past sundown without apology. In Munich, 2 years later, Greta worked in city administration. Reconstruction planning. The slow, patient work of rebuilding a city that had to relearn its own geography. She was good at it. Precise, methodical, capable of holding large amounts of structural information without losing the thread. On the wall of her small office, she had pinned a photograph, not a personal one. A photograph she had found in an American magazine, showing a street in an ode to Dorothy, who was already rising from her chair and gathering her folder. Dorothy looked at her and said something brief in English. Her tone was the same tone she used for everything. Direct, plain, carrying no excess. Greta understood enough now. She said, "She'll be all right." Not a medical assessment. Not information. Just the thing you say to someone when you want them to know you were paying attention and what you saw was going to be fine. Greta looked at her for a moment. Then she said, in English, 2 words she had not said to an American since capture. "Thank you." Dorothy nodded once and walked out into the Tennessee morning. Greta stood in the infirmary entrance room and listened to the ceiling fan and the distant cicadas and the ordinary sounds of the camp going about its Thursday. And she understood that the unfinished sentence she had been carrying since Stuttgart, the one that had pointed toward violation and humiliation and the particular vulnerability of a woman without protection, had finally finished itself. It had finished quietly, in a wooden chair, beside a woman who sat down for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. The repatriation orders came in August. Whitfield read them in the yard the same way he had read everything else, flatly, without editorial, each word placed and complete. The women would be transported to New York, then by ship to Hamburg, then by whatever remained of the German rail system to wherever home still meant something. The room received it differently than the first order, months ago. No one froze. No one touched their collar. The news moved through the group and settled without the particular quality of dread that had accompanied every announcement before it. Greta stood in the yard and listened and felt something she identified, after a moment, in an American town. White houses. A hardware store. A woman hanging laundry on a line. A colleague asked about it once. Greta looked at it for a moment before answering. A measurement, she said, of the distance between what you're told about people and what people actually are. She did not elaborate. The green dress was in a drawer at home, folded exactly as she had folded it in the camp. She did not display it. She did not speak of it. It was simply there. The way certain things are simply there, quiet and specific, carrying the weight of a moment that needed no explanation because the moment had already explained everything.